Let's talk about wide receivers that you should start, or more importantly, sit heading into week 6 of the fantasy football season. We've got a lot of teams on bye this week: the Chiefs, Rams, Dolphins, Vikings. So you will have no Whittington, Tutu, Cup, obviously, Tyreek Waddle, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison. But don't worry, in today's video, I'm going through every team that plays this week, 14 matchups in total. You'll know who to start after you watch this video. Starting off with Thursday Night Football, a divisional matchup, the 49ers at the Seahawks, 47.5 point over under, and San Francisco is favored even though they are traveling over to San Francisco. Look, here's the reality with the 49ers. You have to be aware of this if you own a 49er wide receiver. Any given week, any one of these names could bust. All right. You've got Kittle getting targets. You've got Debo involved. Ayuk just had a game. Juwan Jennings is not a bad player. Thankfully for you guys out there, CMC is not playing because we know he probably gets about 5 targets per game himself. But this is the reality of owning a wide receiver in a very good offense, but he has a ton of competition for targets. Each and every week, this offense might decide, let's use Debo to attack this defense. Let's use Ayuk vertically to stretch them. So you have to be aware of that when you're starting these names. There's a bust potential for anybody out there. The Ayuk owners are probably feeling great right now. It could be this week he busts. The Debo Samuel owners are probably feeling down. This could be a boom game for him. You just have to be aware that it is 100% possible at any point for these guys to be boom or bust. But I'm still going to put them out there. They got to be in your lineups because they're on such a good offense. This is a matchup versus the Seahawks. 14th in schedule adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. So you can definitely beat them in the air. On the opposite side of the ball, we're definitely starting DK Metcalf. Had a great start of the season through the first 4 weeks. Then last week versus the Giants, looked like a good matchup. It didn't work out. Was only 4 for 55, 7.5 fantasy points. Regardless, we're talking about a wide receiver in DK Metcalf who is top 12 in fantasy points scored amongst wide receivers. Of course, he has to be in your lineup. Let's talk about Jackson Smith and Jigba. I would label him a spot start. Oddly enough, if you look at schedule adjusted points allowed, the 49ers are a bottom half, matchup for your wide receivers. But thinking through game script wise, I think it could be very positive for JSN. Why do I say that? Because I believe the Niners are going to be able to score, which means that the Seahawks will never be in positive game script, as in they won't dominate this game entirely to the point where they won't need to throw the ball. That's great news for JSN. We know with Ryan Grubb, this team is throwing the ball much more than they were last year. And what should be an exciting game, I definitely think JSN is in play. And of course, Lockett's in play in deeper formats as well. It was great to see JSN in the end zone last week. All right, moving on to the international game this week. London, 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time game. So make sure you have scheduled your week out. You've set your lineups on Saturday, so you're not surprised when you wake up. Jags at Bears in this one, 42.5 point over under. Let's start with the Jags side of the ball. Brian Thomas, my hot take last week on our players that are going to dominate video, the players that are going to go nuclear, was that Brian Thomas would have over 100 yards. He would have over 17 PPR points. He beat that. He had 23 points, 122 yards, and a TUD. So he absolutely dominated those Colts. But let's be honest for a second. Every indication was that he was going to dominate them, right? Brian Thomas had a high fantasy points per route run against cover 3 schemes. The Colts ran cover 3 more than any other team in the NFL. It was a match made in heaven. Now we're talking about the Chicago Bears, when you adjust for schedule, are the 3rd worst matchup for your wide receivers. Add on to that, this is an international game, and these guys are probably going to be fatigued and jet lagged in ways that we can't really understand. I am labeling Brian Thomas a must start technically because he's getting 8.6 targets per game in the past 3 weeks. But I do think we should drastically lower our expectations for this game for the Jacksonville Jaguars wide receiver. So I can't tell you to sit him. The dude's on a heater. He's a wide receiver 9 through 5 weeks, but I want you to set the right expectations. If you get 12 points from Brian Thomas, you should be happy. You should be content considering how difficult this matchup is. Remember, last week, Deontay Johnson was shut down by this team. And let's talk about Kirk. Look, Kirk, you can start him. I wouldn't want to start him if you can help it. He saw a season low percentage of the snaps last week, 53% of the snaps. He only had 4 targets. He caught all of them, and one of them was a deep target. Otherwise, people would be more concerned about him. I am concerned. I don't think you should start Christian Kirk. Of course, if he's your best option, you have no other clear name, throw him out there and hope that he plays a higher percentage of the snaps and he's out there more. He's not playing in 2 wide receiver sets, but just be aware if you're starting him, there's definitely bust potential. Now let's talk about DJ Moore, one of my favorite plays this week. I am starting DJ Moore everywhere I have him. If you adjust for schedule and you look at points allowed, 2 wide receivers, the Jags are the best matchup in fantasy football. Number 1, point blank period, the best matchup for your fantasy wide receiver. DJ Moore and Caleb Williams got on the same page last week. He scored 2 touchdowns. That's now 3 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. We're starting DJ Moore with a ton of confidence. I don't have the same confidence in an Odunze or Keenan. I would prefer to start Odunze if I had to start one of those names, but the reality is right now, Odunze and Keenan are kind of eating into each other's targets, and it's making this boom bust scenario where this is just mid option right now. I just don't think you should start these names if I'm honest with you. All right, that takes us to the Sunday 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate of games. Commanders at Ravens. This is probably the game that I'm most excited to watch this week. I'm a Commanders fan, but this is tied for the highest over-under of the week as well. 51.5 points. Washington are 6.5 point dogs. Why? FanDuel, explain to me how the 4-1 Commanders, the best offense in the NFL right now, are 6.5 point underdogs. I think this spread should be much closer, but either way, Vegas thinks there'll be a ton of fantasy points in this one, and I concur with the Vegas sportsbooks. Terry McLaurin, a must-start top 15 wide receiver for me in week number 6. Guys, if you adjust for schedule, the Ravens are giving up the second most points to fantasy wide receivers. That secondary is like Swiss cheese. There are holes everywhere. It's a free day. You get a reception, you get a touchdown, you get a 50-yard catch. It's Oprah giving out fantasy points to everybody. Terry McLaurin, I believe, is going to dominate. I'm so excited to play him this week. And he could have had an even better week last week if he didn't drop that touchdown and have that fumble. Now, as far as Zay Flowers goes, last week we labeled him a must start. I know it was really difficult to start him, but we just felt like the game script was going to be heavily in his favor versus the Bengals divisional matchup. We felt like they were going to need to be back and forth in that game. I feel the same way this week versus the Commanders. Of course, you have to recognize that there is boom bust potential with a name like Zay Flowers, but coming off a game where he had 12 targets, going into a game where it could be back and forth, 2 very good offenses, I think Zay Flowers is in play again this week. All right, moving on to our next matchup, which is the Cardinals at the Packers, 49.5 point over under. The Packers are favored, and this is the 3rd highest over under of the week. Let's start with the Cardinals. Marvin Harrison Jr. had a disappointing game last week. He did have 7 targets. He and Kyler Murray could not get on the same page, okay? But this is still a player that we are going to start with confidence. Remember, 3 out of his 5 games this year, he has been the definition of a week winner, right? Multiple touchdowns in week 2, 17 points in week 3 versus Detroit, scored a touchdown versus Washington. So I know sometimes the recency bias makes you think, should I really start this guy? Personally, I would be starting him. The Packers are a top 8 matchup for fantasy wide receivers and scheduled adjusted points allowed. So I'm definitely going to be playing him. Look, Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch, I feel like every other week, these guys are kind of going back and forth between who's the number 2. So I don't think you should start them, but of course, anything can happen. And then with the Packers side of the ball, okay, yes, last week we were starting Dontavion Wicks. I started him, all right? And it didn't work out. But I still feel like there are reasons to start Wicks this week. Clearly, Jaden Reed is a must start every week moving forward. It doesn't matter. All right, he's a must start regardless. But let's talk about Dontavion Wicks. Leads the team in targets with 7. And if you haven't gone back and watched the film, I'd encourage you to do so. Because yes, Wicks had a bad drop, but there's also blame here on Jordan Love. If you rewatch that game and you actually see the targets that Dontavion Wicks had, on my Twitter you can, then you would realize that Jordan Love did not play his best game. He did not help out Dontavion Wicks. Dontavion Wicks was getting open. He was running good routes, but more than half of those targets were not catchable. They just weren't good targets. Yes, he had the bad drop, but even if you look at him running down the side of the field, butt-ass naked, in stride, if that ball was in stride to end the game in the 4th quarter, he can catch that, run into the end zone. The ball is short-handed. It becomes a contested catch. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I still think you can start Wicks. He's a spot start for me. It's a good matchup versus the Cardinals. And this game could be back and forth with two offenses that can score points. So look, if you don't want to start Wicks, you're nervous about it, I get it. But in my situation where I lost Cooper Kupp, where I lost Rashee Rice, where we have so many injuries and so many bye weeks and we can't play the Tyreek Hills and the Jordan Addisons and the Justin Jeffersons, Wicks is definitely in play for me. So look, Wicks could have played better, but I'm just telling you, I think there is better games ahead for him. Romeo Doubs, again, in that spot start category, if you want to play him, I would prefer Wicks, but I understand if you prefer Doubs. All right, the fifth matchup we will look at here is the Texans at the Patriots. 38.5 point over under. The Texans are favored. The New England Patriots are 7-point dogs at home. And this is the third lowest over under of the week. So there's not a lot of fantasy points to chase here. Just looking at the matchup, it doesn't look sexy. Vegas agrees. They don't expect a lot of points. Really, Stephon Diggs is like the name I'm excited to start. You can't start Nico Collins because he has that hamstring injury unless he miraculously recovers. And I guess you can spot start Tank Dell. But last week when Nico Collins went out, this team decided to play Xavier Hutchinson over Tank Dell in two wide receiver sets. Xavier Hutchinson outsnapped Tank Dell for the first time in his career. So yes, technically, Tank Dell should have a chance to bounce back. It's a good matchup. But there's a chance that they just don't want to use him like they did last year. So you have to be really cautious there. Diggs is the only name I can really say in this entire matchup that you can start with any confidence. All right, moving on to the sixth matchup, the Bucs at the Saints. Divisional matchup here. Now, this one just got very complicated because Monday Night Football just finished about an hour or two ago, and Derek Carr was injured. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of context in this one that you need to stay tuned to. First off, the Bucs are a top 5 matchup for fantasy wide receivers right now when you adjust for schedule. Great matchup. Olave, Shaheed should both be smash starts. Here's the issue. The issue is we don't know if Derek Carr is going to play. And if Jake Hayner's out there throwing the ball, how can I, with any confidence, suggest for you to start those wide receivers in New Orleans? How can I do that? So here's how we will play it. If Derek Carr plays, both Olave and Shaheed are must starts. Now, if you watched our streams throughout the week, we did say be careful with Olave because the Chiefs love to take away the number one option. They've done it the entire season. Olave only has 4 targets versus the Chiefs. He gets shut down. The number 2, Shaheed, goes off. Now, Shaheed, definitely, if Derek Carr is playing, Shaheed's a must start. I mean, he's averaging 10 targets per game in the last 2 weeks. You can't not start Shaheed if Derek Carr's out there. But if Derek Carr is ruled out, Olave becomes a spot start and Shaheed becomes a sit. I'm sorry. I don't know how you're going to bet on Jake Hayner in this matchup. You do it if you want, but I can't do it myself. On the opposite side of the ball, we have 2 top 12 must starts in my rankings this week. Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. They both had a decent amount of targets last week. Godwin was open in the end zone. He decided to throw it to Evans. Mama said there'd be days like this, but Godwin still had a pretty good game. He just didn't get into the end zone. But you got to keep starting Godwin. You got to keep starting Evans. I mean, right now that Bucs offense is firing on all cylinders. All right, the 7th matchup that we will look at is the Browns at the Eagles. Eagles are heavy favorites in this one at home. The Browns are 8.5 point dogs on the road. I still think Amari Cooper is a must start right now. In the last 3 weeks, he's averaging about 10 targets per game. The unfortunate reality is that Deshaun Watson is throwing about, 50% of his balls as catchable targets. So Deshaun Watson is not playing well. There's no way around that. The reality is there will be games where you're frustrated that Deshaun Watson can't get Amari Cooper the ball. There will be games where you're like, can we please get Jameis Winston in there? Please, for the love of God. I'm saying that myself, okay? But the matchup is good. The Eagles right now are top 5 matchup for fantasy wide receivers. If you adjust for schedule, which is what we want to do, it's the most accurate way to do it. And Amari Cooper is going to get so many targets. The Browns are probably going to be down throughout this game. I think he's definitely in play. Now, as far as the opposite side of the ball, of course, A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, you've been waiting on these guys to come back. You've been waiting to put them right into your lineup. Go ahead and do so. It's a tough matchup versus the Browns technically, but they're definitely guys that I'm starting this week with confidence. All right, the 8th matchup we'll look at here, divisional matchup again, the Colts at the Titans. And just like we said last week, if Joe Flacco is playing, I am so excited to start the Colts wide receivers. If Anthony Richardson is playing, can't do it. Can't do it. The guy's averaging 50% completion percentage. It's worse than Deshaun Watson somehow. So, if Joe Flacco plays, Michael Pittman and Josh Downs are both must starts, top 25 names. If Anthony Richardson plays, I don't want to start any of these guys. That's as simple as it is, okay? And you have to keep in mind that even if Flacco plays, this is a tough matchup versus Tennessee. The Titans are giving up the second fewest points to fantasy wide receivers right now. So this is a tough matchup. You have got to hope that Joe Flacco is there to save Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. And on the opposite side of the ball, look, it's technically a good matchup, but the reality is that Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, they've been the definition of boom bust. And it has a lot to do with the fact that Will Levis is like basically Carson Wentz with the Colts. Tell me I'm wrong. That is basically what Will Levis is right now. It's like, oh my God, that play was incredible. And the very next play, you're like, what the hell was that? What was he thinking? Is this guy all there up top? I mean, I don't know how you can trust these names. In deeper formats, sure, throw them out there, hope for the boom game, but expect a lot of bust games for the rest of the year for these names. All right, this brings us to the afternoon slate of games. An AFC West showdown, the Chargers at the Broncos. 36.5 point over under. This is tied for the lowest over under of the week. So there are not many wide receivers to chase in this one for fantasy football. I'd be very hesitant chasing this matchup. I don't want to start any Bronco. Last week, they changed their identity to be built around the running backs. I could see them continuing to do that because they're winning games. And for the Chargers, Ladd McConkey is the only name that you can consider. But if you're playing Ladd McConkey, you have to be aware that the Broncos are the worst matchup in fantasy football right now. Easily the worst matchup in fantasy football. I'm not starting Quentin Johnston. I think he gets the Pat Surtain treatment. I don't know, man. It's just, there's like a glimmer of hope here for Ladd McConkey, but that's the only name I can even think about considering when I'm looking at this matchup. It's just not fun. All right, the 10th matchup we'll look at, back-to-back games with the lowest over-unders of the week. Steelers at Raiders, not a lot of points expected in this one. 36.5 point over under. George Pickens is really weird in Pittsburgh right now. I mean, they were very intentional about not using him in last week's game. He had a season low snap percentage, 59%. He was targeted 7 times, but they weren't very good targets. He was in contested catch situations. I mean, this is a very talented player, a great player locked in a situation that you just can't rely on. So can you play him? Sure. I mean, the matchup looks great. Raiders are a top 10 matchup for your wide receivers. You want to target this one, but can you rely on this offense? Can you rely on Arthur Smith? Can you rely on Justin Fields? You make that call. I think 75% of people have a better name out there, but you might be in a deeper format. Now, as far as the Raiders go, let's play this 2 different ways. The first way is if Davante Adams plays. Now, by the time you're watching this, Davante Adams might be traded. Davante Adams might be a Jet. He might be a Bill. He might be a Cowboy. I don't know. I mean, shoot, he might be a Commander. I don't know. But if Davante Adams plays and he's a Raider, of course you're going to start Davante Adams. In the scenario where Davante Adams does not play, this is not a good matchup. The Steelers are a tough defense. But you can start Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker. I would prefer to play Jacoby Myers, and Trey Tucker is literally the definition of a Hail Mary play. All right, the 11th matchup we'll look at is the Falcons at the Panthers. NFC South showdown here. 48.5 point over under, and the Falcons are favored. Deontay Johnson is back in play. Was not a good game versus the Chicago Bears. But Chicago is a matchup that you just cannot target. I mean, right now they are the 3rd worst matchup for wide receivers. That secondary is legit. You can beat the Bears on the ground. You cannot beat the Bears through the air. So that's what we'll say about last week with Deontay Johnson. Now, assuming Andy Dalton is playing again this week, which fingers crossed, let's hope that continues, we're definitely going to play Deontay Johnson. Falcons are a top 12 matchup right now when you adjust for schedule. He's in play. I expect him to bounce back. Now, for the Falcons side of the ball, we've got 2 must starts now, maybe every week. Maybe moving forward every week, we will have that. Drake London, a top 6 play for me. Darnell Mooney, my wide receiver 27. Both of these names in play. We have seen the identity of this Falcons offense completely shift in the last 2 weeks. from run focused to pass focused. We don't know if those trends will continue, but each and every week we've been chipping away at it. Kirk Cousins is throwing the ball more. They're running the ball less. They're targeting London and Mooney more. So I think that's a trend that could stick. And the Panthers, you can beat them in the air. They're a top 10 matchup for wide receivers. So I do think both of these names are in play. The 12th matchup we'll look at here is the Lions at the Cowboys. 51.5 point over under. This is tied for the highest over under of the week. So there should be a lot of fantasy cheese in this one right here. The Lions are favored in Dallas. Honestly, I get why. The Lions are such a good team. Now, Amon-Ra St. Brown, a must start. My wide receiver one this week has been great since week 2. He hasn't scored under 20 PPR points. Jameson Williams, a spot start, a guy that you can put out there, but a little bit boom bust. We have to recognize that. I mean, last time out versus Seattle, he had 2 targets. He turned that into 16 points because he scored a touchdown, a long touchdown. But we have to recognize that there is a chance Jameson Williams could bust at any point because he doesn't have a high percentage of the targets in Detroit. Now let's talk about the Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb, my wide receiver 2 this week, and I definitely think he's in play. Look, it hasn't been exactly what you wanted it to be for CeeDee Lamb just yet, but defenses are really focusing on stopping him. Of course they are. Don't get me started. Jerry Jones always thinks he's playing chess, but he's playing checkers. Yeah, we're all in this. I mean, should you try for Derrick Henry? Should you draft a running back? Should you get a complimentary wide receiver? No, we're all in, but we're not going to do anything on offense. Don't get me started. The point is, CeeDee Lamb will have much better games in the future. All right. As Jalen Tolbert has a game, as Rico Dowdle starts to look better and better, as Jake Ferguson is getting healthier and healthier, CeeDee Lamb is going to have better games moving forward. And Jalen Tolbert is a spot start for me. I mean, last week, first game without Brandon Cooks, he has 10 targets, a touchdown, over 21 fantasy points. I definitely think he's in play. And the highest over-under of the week, he'll be a really fun streaming option this week. And the 13th game we'll look at here, Sunday Night Football, Bengals at Giants, 48.5 point over-under. The Bengals desperately need to win this game. I mean, it is not good in Cincinnati. The sun is going down, big guy. But Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, both must starts in fantasy football. T. Higgins is averaging about 10 or 11 targets per game since he came back from injury. And Jamar Chase is a wide receiver 1 right now through 5 weeks in fantasy football. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, both of these guys are must starts every single week. And on the opposite side, we are hoping, we are praying. We don't know at the time of recording this, but I do believe Malik Neighbors will be back ready to go from that concussion. The wide receiver 4 through 5 weeks, and he missed a game. And he's still the wide receiver 4 in fantasy football. The guy was leading the league in targets before he went down with an injury. On a per game basis, he is still leading the league in targets. You have got to put this guy in your lineup. And the Bengals are a great matchup, top 6 against fantasy wide receivers. And of course, Wan'Dale Robinson in PPR formats is definitely a name that you can put out there. The guy is getting fed volume. It's crazy how many times they target this guy per game. So in PPR leagues, totally, you can put him out there. But in non-PPR formats, he wouldn't even sniff my lineup. And the last game we'll look at is Monday Night Football, Bills, Jets. If you remember back to last year, Aaron Rodgers' first game as a Jet. We won't say anything more. We don't want to, curse any bad juju on this one. But Garrett Wilson, my goodness, this is what we've all been waiting for. A 22 target game. Has 29 fantasy points, gets into the end zone. I am hoping and praying that this is a trend of things to come. What I will say, though, is last week was a good matchup versus the Vikings. Vikings are a good defense, but you can beat them in the air. This is not a good matchup versus the Bills. The Bills are 5th in points allowed, fewest points allowed to fantasy wide receivers. So I just want to make sure you're setting the right expectations heading into this game, but I would say he's still a must start for me. We can also talk about Allen Lazard, who is continually getting peppered with targets and doing very little with it, but Aaron Rodgers likes the guy, so if you're desperate, you can play Allen Lazard. It's just, I feel like at some point this has to end. I don't feel like it can continue for the rest of the season. And for the Bills, Khalil Shakir is really the only name I'm interested in starting in this team. Yes, Keon Coleman had a touchdown last week, but he caught 1 out of 5 targets. The guy struggles running routes. it's just, there's a lot of development still for Keon Coleman to have. And as far as Khalil Shakir, he's just been the most consistent name of any Buffalo Bills wide receiver. So what should be a good game, Shakir should have, a decent floor. I appreciate you guys watching the video. Do me a favor, hit that like button to show some love. Subscribe if you like the content. And last thing I'll say is if you want to ask me a start-sit question or a trade question, or if you want your team reviewed, check out the link in the pinned comment. It's a link to our website where you can reach us at any time. I appreciate you for watching, and we'll see you soon. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.